All right, good evening. It's 5:30 on May the 6th. This is the pre-agenda meeting for the Town of Spencer Board of Aldermen. And officially call the meeting to order. We have 5 out of our 6 board members present this evening. And we'll start with an invocation and a pledge of allegiance. Mr. Morgan, will you lead us in an invocation, please?
Sure. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the many blessings you bestow upon us each and every day, some that we most assuredly do not know about. Give us guidance to get through these troubled times. Let us provide inspiration for those around us and those in our community. Thank you for what you have provided for us, and bless this town, and look after our efforts and make us wise in doing so. Amen.
Amen. Please rise for the pledge of allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right.
Scared me there for a minute. I almost broke into my supper blessing.
Don't do that unless you brought supper for us.
Yeah, it's okay.
Good food, good meat, good God bless eat.
All right, we have several agenda items tonight. Of course, per our usual pre-agenda meeting, we will review our regular agenda for next Tuesday night's monthly meeting. But the first item on the list is a presentation from InFocus on our Spencer Development Ordinance for 160D, and to consider setting a public hearing date for June the 1st at 6 p.m. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Franzese to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Mayor and members of the board. Tonight we have Rick Flo with InFocus Consulting, and Kyle Harris, our planning staff, is also here, and I'm gonna get out of the way and let them provide this presentation. This, of course, represents a lot of work, and including working very closely with the planning board leading up to this. And so with that, I'll let them jump right in.
Great, and I'll just take a moment to thank our folks with InFocus for their work, and thank Kyle Harris for leading the effort on behalf of the town. And thank you, we have a few planning board members here tonight. The chair, Mr. Mosher, Mr. Gobble, thank you both for being here tonight, and thank you for your group's leadership through this process.
All right, well, thank you all very much. I'm going to provide a brief introduction before I hand it over to Rick. Yes, what Peter said earlier is correct. I just wanted to add that the planning board has done a really good job doing this over such an abbreviated time frame, and I want to thank Rick for helping accommodate that process. Well, we've really gotten a lot done in a short amount of time, and we have been able to really dive deep into the minutiae of this new ordinance. And so Rick is going to provide a general overview of what changes are coming with this new ordinance. Where the process is right now, the planning board did recommend adoption of the new UDO at their meeting in April. I think it was April 12th. And so that entails the adoption of the new Unified Development Ordinance, as well as a new zoning map, a new table of uses, and various other pertinent documents, including the technical standards and new rules of procedure for the planning board and the Board of Aldermen. So Rick is going to give an overview of that. But going forward, what I think our expectation is tonight is if y'all are comfortable with doing it, we're ready to go ahead and set the date for the public legislative hearing. We've tentatively identified June 1st as the best date to do a called meeting to accomplish that. We will be running public notices in the Salisbury Post at least 2 times. We've also identified a possible third date to run the public notice. I provided y'all a copy of the ad that will run. This is something that Rick and InFocus helped us develop. We will also be sending this notice to all out-of-town property owners in Spencer. And so the goal is to get the word out that this process is happening and that it's going to be accomplished very soon. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rick to give his presentation, and I'll be here during and after to help answer any questions that y'all have. I will also note that before you leave today, you're free to take a copy of the public review draft. I did go ahead and bind several copies. You also have access to everything on Google Drive, but sometimes I find it's useful to be able to have a hard copy to annotate and to look through. And then we also have several additional copies of the new official zoning map. I have 4 here, but we also have several more in the back. All right, I'll pass it over to Rick.
Thank you, Kyle. Can everyone hear me all right? Is my mic working? Okay. Mayor, members of the board, it's a pleasure to be in this room before you. I remember this room fondly from many years ago. I was working with the town starting in July of 1987 and did quite a bit of planning work in the late 80s here. So, and worked with your planning board then and your previous boards and what have you. And I have fond memories of those days in Spencer. But without further ado, I want to follow up on something that Kyle mentioned a moment ago about the planning board. And I want to, since he brought it up, I'm going to go ahead and sort of move that to the forefront. And that is to stress to you that under the statutes, everything that you consider in this arena has to come through the planning board and the planning board make a recommendation. It doesn't bind you to their recommendation, but the purpose of that is for you to have a visionary perspective on a topic. Let's say it's a rezoning or something along those lines that's looking at something in Spencer, okay? And the state statutes have now sort of taken a fresh approach to that to encourage boards to separate out the big picture from the little picture. The little picture being it's something's next door to my house. I've lived here, I live right beside it, that sort of local aspect of it. So the planning board's role is now much more clearly intact under the new statutes, and therefore this new ordinance is going to re-emphasize it to put them in as the visionary for the community. Now, what do? When you receive that visionary group's recommendation, you then host a hearing on that subject. Let's say it's a rezoning, and you hear from the neighbors. So you've got that big picture perspective, and you've got that right there in my backyard perspective. And then you have, and you alone, by the statute now, have the distinct pleasure and responsibility of making a decision. And so that is something that's a clear directive out of Raleigh that you're going to be learning more and more about as we go through not just this session, but any follow-up meetings or hearings or anything that you choose that you would like to dive into. So with that said, what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask our Planning Commission Chair, Planning Board Chairman, if he would like to take just a moment and maybe share a formal statement just to reiterate that this is a recommendation that is now being formally passed from the Planning Board to you in this meeting. Okay, Mr. Moser?
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and folks of the board. I would like to thank everyone on our board and Rick here for being diligent every Monday night for months on end, going late into the night. What was it, 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning? You ordered pizza. He would always tell us.
I thought we were late.
We learned a lot. Very exciting what's going on here, and we just, excited about we get to recommend this to you guys. Thank you.
And if you of course, you have his sidekick, another planning board member present tonight. And I'd also like to acknowledge that during this process, every step of the way, one of your own, Alderwoman Sledge, participated in, listening to all the recommendations and discussions and in-depth and even contributed questions and challenges for us along the way so that we could really kind of test on the fly, if you will. Is that a fair statement, Alderwoman? So it was a great exercise. Just to give you a little bit of a window on me, I moved up through Spencer and others like you, China Groves and Kannapolis's, and ended up working for big communities. And I didn't enjoy that. and I stepped away from that about 20 years ago. And I sold that business that did that work. And I went off and had a non-compete agreement, so I worked in private development for investor groups, mostly NFL players and NASCAR drivers and other, folks around with the money to do something like that. So I gained a lot of experience on the development and land side of it, which added to my background, which had started out in civil engineering, land surveying and civil engineering before planning. So it rounded me off a little better. Then when my non-compete agreement ran out, I went back to my passion. But keep in mind that there's no better way to start a business than after you've sold one, because then you know what you don't want to do again. My youth allowed me to progress probably faster and bigger than I ever probably should have for my own good, for my own happiness factor. And so starting when that non-compete ran out in 2008, flipping the switch back to local government, I was able to say, okay, this time, number one, I'm not going to work for the big communities. The answer is just no. The orders around my office are City of Charlotte, City of Columbia, any of those call. The answer is just no, thank you. It's not rewarding to me in my heart. They were bigger contracts and they were financially attractive and all that, but I got tired of airplane flights and three-piece suits and all kinds of, wearing a necktie 5 days a week and things of that nature. It wore me out. The second aspect is we specialize in North Carolina now. Being a planner across the country is one thing in theory, but it's another in practice. And I pick up plans now done by professionals from out of state all the time. They make all these recommendations that are not even legitimate under the statutes in North Carolina. So it's misguiding. So to me, practicing in North Carolina alone, therefore we don't cross the state line unless we're on vacation. So specializing in small communities and specializing in North Carolina is what we do. Our research involves techniques nationwide, but our application involves municipalities right here at home. And there are 550 of you in this state, just in case you did not know that number. When you get down to about number 25, you're somewhere around Salisbury. We work for a couple that are that size, and that's about it. When you get to the top 20, we just stay away from it, except for Gastonia. They talked us into something at the last minute to help them. So we have a couple of exemptions from that or exclusions from that. But that gives you a little bit of perspective on who's done your work here with your planning board and with Kyle on staff. Now, with that said, I want to, I'm not going to take you through the ordinance in a lengthy page by page or section by section introduction. I'm going to probably introduce a couple things to you on the screen, and we're going to move along fairly efficiently here. But to let you know how this began, the state of North Carolina replaced its general statutes that enable you. Now remember, you're actually an extension of, or what they call a political subdivision of the state. So they enable you, they authorize you to exercise certain authority, right? They took the old statutes and repealed them and replaced them with an entirely new set. That new set was supposed to do two things, but it did three. The two things it was supposed to do is, number one, it was to take all the changes they had made over the years and reorganize them and clean them up so they weren't just sort of scattered and hard to follow, because every now and then over a 60-year period, you make a little change here and a little change there. The next thing you know, you're not sure if the old Volkswagen's got some other parts in it that it wasn't supposed to have or not. And so it wasn't running very smoothly. The second thing that they did was they set out to reach into the case law. That means all the rulings that judges had made on this subject over the last 60 years in North Carolina, because those case rulings can influence how a court may interpret. If the state law says one thing, but it doesn't really go into enough detail, on something, a case may actually offer insight on how you would look at that detail. So that's called case law. So they factored in a lot of that case law because they had clarity. Okay. So we were supposed to basically get a clean version of what we already had in existence, just disorganized and scattered about. So they were setting out to clean that up, consolidate it, eliminate the need to go research a bunch of cases and all that. Okay? But they also took a little time to make some adjustments while they were in there. You know, you can't, I'm sorry, but I'm gonna say it, you can't take a group of politicians in a big old room and expect them to just move it through in a nice, logical, sensible way without them saying, well, yeah, but we could tweak this and we could adjust to that. And so they did a little bit of that. So that's the third thing that happened to it. Now, you're getting it through what I call the nozzle of the fire hose, because your planning board worked on this for a long time. And it's approximately 400 pages of material. That 400 pages of material has a lot of tools in the toolbox for the town, some of which you may never need. But if you don't have them, you will wish you had. So think of that wrench in your toolbox or screwdriver in your toolbox that you only use once in a while, or you never actually use that one, but you use the other ones mostly. That's kind of the way we set this up. Because I can't tell you how often I hear towns say, oh my gosh, we don't have anything about that. What do we do? You know, when they're confronted with that challenge. So we try to build the toolbox with as much flexibility and equipment in it as possible. So it's ready should you need it. Most of it is going to fall into the same old buckets that you're kind of used to. Okay. A lot of things like that are pretty normal. I want to build a house. I want to add something on. I want to do this or that. That sort of thing is not radically changing. What is radically changing is your authority on how much subjectivity that you have. That is changing dramatically. And I want to underscore that. That is the predominant factor that this new legislation puts on the table. No more will you be able to say, well, we're going to have a conditional use on that subdivision, and they're going to come in here, and if we don't like it, we're going to vote that subdivision down, or we're going to make them put all these conditions on it. That has changed dramatically. You'll notice a little thing in there called a special use permit and a little thing in there called conditional zoning, but no more of that conditional use zoning and conditional use permits and what have you, where you would sort of tell the developer what they were going to do. Now it has to be written out with a few exceptions. Those exceptions need to be pretty unique. So now you've got an ordinance that has all the concerns that we might ordinarily have about so many different things, so you're not making it up as you go. Have you ever been in a room and somebody said, well, I think that's going to be too close, they ought to put a buffer here or something like that? We have to spell all that out. You can't just make it up. Now, if you had something really unique, like the property was high and so the lights were going to shine in a window or what have you, you may be able to get the developer to agree to accept a condition. At which time it goes into the record, it goes into the minutes, it goes onto the plan, it goes into the permit. Otherwise, it doesn't count. So no more would there be the board saying, well, I'm not going to approve this unless they'll agree to do this or that. You have to approve if they meet the standards, is basically what it boils down to. So your control is moving. I'm trying to keep this at a general elevation or general high level without just getting into the little detailed words and tell you what the fundamental change is. So the real control that the governing board has, and make no mistake about it, you have the ultimate control, but you don't have it at the level of telling a developer what they're going to do and not do if the zoning's there. So what does that mean for you? It means that the official zoning map becomes the real device that you have to manage growth and development. Now, what you have in town now, and I'm not being paid to sugarcoat anything. Okay, so I'm gonna be blatantly honest with you. And I don't intend to insult anyone that may have championed something like this, but I'm gonna say it this way. You have a whole bunch of of R8 in this town, R8 zoning. Okay, you've got bukus of it. So if somebody walks in the door with a plat and throws it on the table under your old ordinance and wants to do a subdivision at that density, they have the right to do that. In the past, you might have said, well, we're gonna have them jump through all these hoops before they get that approval. That's over. That's over, okay? The only hoop jumping that people can be held to now are when you really got scary stuff. I call it the scary stuff, okay? Not a subdivision, not some new houses, truly scary stuff. You know, a hazardous waste incinerator, or, you get my drift? Something that's gonna scare people to death, you know, and everybody gets up in arms. So we built that in to your ordinance. So if something scary comes out to the interstate or anywhere, you've got the tools in the toolbox to manage that and put a few steps in front of them before you have that final decision made, okay? So with that said, I've kind of introduced that big picture of the structure. So in your new zoning map, we're peeling the onion back a little bit to get you back to where you actually are today. Okay, by that I mean what's on the ground for all practical purposes, with only a little bit of what I'll call forward-thinking zoning, which means, I'm going to say it this way, speculative zoning around the interstate with some commercial things like that and job opportunities. But if you get too carried away and oversupply the market in the new day and time, you know, you make everything along Salisbury out here commercial from one end to the other, then you're gonna wish you hadn't when some project comes up or doesn't. So we peel the onion back a little bit and zone to what's on the ground, with a couple of exceptions, zone to what's on the ground. So when change is brought to you, the first thing is to rezone or not to rezone. Why is that important? It's important because a change in zoning has to be justified. No change does not have to be. So if you don't like a proposition, just vote no, and you don't even have to explain it. If you do like the proposition, vote yes. Somebody comes to town and says, well, I want to rezone this agricultural area to single-family residential at 3 units an acre, and you're not comfortable with it at that location because it's just too far out, or something's not right about the sewer extension, or you don't have the water, or you don't like anything about it, you can just vote no. If it's zoned R8 like it is now, you really have no more say in it. As long as they meet what's written in your current ordinance, sign and go, okay? And that's when you get people saying, wait a minute, I can't believe they did this. How'd the town let them do this? And that sort of thing. So it puts more control back in your lap legitimately, okay? Now, the exceptions to that are, like I said, some known areas for economic development around the interchange, because I like to be pro-business. I like to be pro-citizen, pro-property owner. We'll take the citizen and the property owner and kind of put them together. Pro-business, pro-citizen, property owner. The third is natural resources. Whether you're a tree hugger or tree cutter, doesn't really matter. You're not going to ever like each other, but if you like the policy because it works for the developer positively and it works for natural resources positively, then you don't need them to like each other because they both like what you're doing. The fourth is leadership. That's you, that's your appointed boards, that's your staff, that's the team of leadership. And the fifth win scenario is those looking to invest in your community, whether they're local, whether they're not. Doesn't really matter, because most of your new infrastructure over time, especially with what's happening now in the marketplace, is going to be built by private money. New streets, new water, new sewer extensions for new homes. that type of thing, and it's built by that private money. So you want to create the win, 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 the 5-win scenario to create that. Now, when you're looking at the historic areas, when you're looking at the older village areas, that's an entirely different scenario. So the ordinance needs to speak to those areas. And unfortunately, your old ordinance didn't solve that problem either. Your R8, which applies throughout much of your older areas, actually created a lot of what we call non-conforming buildings. There's a slang term for non-conforming that you've all, I'm sure, heard called the grandfather clause or the grandparent clause. What that means is when it was built, it met the standards in effect at the time, if there were standards. But then the standards changed. Well, the house is still sitting there. So if the new standard says the setback's got to be 30 feet and your house was built 16 feet back, you're a non-conforming house. Now, in the old days, meaning before the recession of 2008 and 9, which resulted in the Dodd-Frank Act, which cleaned up the financial industry in theory. That was its purpose, to deal with the financial industry, which includes 2 major components, financing and insurance. Risk became the issue. Dodd-Frank said, you institutions have got to do a better job managing your exposure, aka risk. Now that trickles all the way back here to this ordinance. That trickles all the way back to this ordinance. When we create a large number of non-conforming structures, aka they're grandfathered in, 15 years ago, that'd be no problem. Somebody said, no problem, we can, it's grandfathered in, it can stay there. Well, but if it were damaged a certain percentage, it couldn't be replaced as it was. It would have to then conform. So what that means is that a house that, let's say, is damaged 50% in a storm, big tree falls on it or who knows what, in the old days, you'd say, well, it's grandfathered in, 50% has got to move back or whatever. The insurance company would end up paying a total loss on that because the house couldn't be rebuilt where it was. It would have to be moved. That's just an example. And Dodd-Frank said that's a no-no. Now what that means is that more and more financial institutions and insurers are checking on that with new purchases. So if a citizen here in town needed to refinance their home, a lot of times now they will be asking for zoning verification letters out of town halls, insurance policies. Not all of them are doing it, but more and more of them are doing it. And we see that more and more. So the more that we have to say, oh, it's grandfathered in, that's actually a bad thing. We just in the past 2 weeks, we've seen a deal fall through in another town in Rowan County because of that. So another refinance is all it was, refinancing a house. So what we've done is we've created a district around those older areas of town. Remember I said your zoning map is really kind of where we are? It's that future land use plan that's where you want to go. So you zone for where you are, and then you can always change it when you're ready to see some progress in some area. Not a problem. But if you have too many grandfathered situations, you actually are not helping your citizens and property owners, okay? So that's one of the things that we're doing. We're taking some of that R8 out of the picture and scaling it back more to what is either there or what is more likely to be there. Another aspect, so I'm going to shift gears now away from the older parts of town. I have an affectionate name I call those areas. I call them the BZ era neighborhoods, before zoning. Okay, the BZ era is before zoning, and we've got a district made for that. Now, whether you've got some historic, part of it in your historic area or part of it not in your historic area, doesn't really matter. The historic district takes care of the historic aspects. But the rest of the property issues and standards and specifications are in your zoning, whether it's in the historic district or not. And we call it the residential Main Street transition. So it's that area of residence around the downtown that really transitions you out from the core through those older neighborhoods into where the new things start to happen, whether it's a new development that came about in the last 20 years or some that's going to come about in the next 20 years. And so that district is really set up to avoid throwing your citizens under the bus. Okay? And so there's been a lot of work just to underscore what it takes to actually figure all this out. Now, on the new side of things, and you do need to, and I can't tell you how many times I say, well, we haven't had a big new subdivision in X number of years or Y number of years, but what we're seeing is the steamrollers coming out of Charlotte, and it's changing. It's changing every day. Down in Landis, they're doing the same thing you are right now. Okay, they're a little bit ahead of you, but not far. And it's like about the time we started the new stuff, they start getting all these inquiries about all these new developments and all this change. So it's rolling its way up that I-85 corridor. And so you need to be prepared for that. For new development, for new subdivisions, okay, because you can no longer be subjective in your decision making, it's best to set a standard that you can live with and let that be that. And if a developer comes up and says, hey, we want to do more density than that, we want to do 4 units an acre or something along those lines, that's where you get into challenges. You can do density if you pay attention to design. And if we had more time, I can walk you right through that. That's what's on your screen right there. But if you don't have more strict standards on design, which gets into grading, how you transition slopes from lot to lot to lot without the V ditches in between, because there's all kinds of issues that go with different building techniques. And Alderwoman Sledge has seen all of this, so she was shaking her head, I think, out of, boy, that some of it's scary looking, isn't it? And it doesn't do what it really should do. It doesn't produce what you really want it to produce, which is what? A good neighborhood? Is that what you really want a new development to really be, a good neighborhood? So I'm going to ask my proverbial question I ask of all planning boards and city councils, the boards of aldermen. And I'm going to ask you, has anybody here ever heard of Richard Pryor? Richard Pryor actually had a profound effect on my success in this business. And I'm going to paraphrase a point that he made. Now, of course, he was telling a joke, but there was a profound undertone about what you do, what I do, what Kyle, what your planning board does every day. He says, and I paraphrase, this is a neighborhood. This is not a residential district. That did not get past me, man. That smacked me right smack between the eyes, probably 30 years or 40 years ago. And I thought, that's exactly what we do. It's not about R6 and R8. It's about neighborhoods. Thinking about where children are going to grow up, where people are going to age and retire, where neighbors know each other, and that list goes on and on and on. And frankly, towns have made big mistakes with that since zoning was brought about. A lot of it's in the numbers. Shows up in the numbers. Numbers that are arbitrarily sometimes because of people's perspective. Somebody will say, well, I think it ought to be 80, and somebody else will say, well, I think it ought to be 100. Those numbers have nothing really to do with the quality of life in a built environment. Those numbers, whenever I start hearing big round numbers like that, I just chuckle. In Rutherfordton, they had a R10 with a 10,000 square foot lot that had to be at least 100 feet wide. Now, if you run those numbers, that means that lot was 100 by 100. The house had to be 40 feet back from the street right away with a 25-foot backyard setback. So when you got to the end of the task, you found that there was very little that they could actually do without somebody really mean like Kyle having to say, I'm sorry, but no. You know, you got to meet this setback, you got to meet that, you got to meet these other things. So those numbers like 25, 40, 100, 10, they don't make for neighborhood. Neighborhood is not based on those kinds of figures. It's based on figures that are way off of big, even, round numbers. Your draft ordinance uses some examples, and I'm going to ask for just a moment if Mike would pull up Article 8 and go to page 9. And I'm going to show you a table of what's in your draft for pretty standard developments. When I say standard, I'm talking about somebody can walk in the door, meet all the specifications on their plans, and it's pretty straightforward. Get their approvals and go to work and build the houses and put the streets in and do all those things. Let's scoot down to page 9. I believe it's the correct page number. Should be a big table. There we go. It's on page 10. You'll see 3 columns. And if I may I step away from the microphone? Am I speaking loud enough for the clerk to pick me up?
I think so.
Okay. In the single-family residential 3 district, I'm not smart enough to do this the hard way, as the planning board well knows. That rounds out to about 3 units per acre. That doesn't mean a third of an acre lot. It means 3 units per acre at the end of the day. That includes the open space like parks and everything, and the street right-of-ways and what have you. But you'll see I've got a lot size of 11,600. Right now you got 6 out there and you got 8 out there, predominantly 8. So you're starting out with a very small lot that doesn't leave many good opportunities for a quality neighborhood. And I'm talking about quality neighborhoods being about people. Okay? 60 feet wide. 20-foot front yard setback, 8-foot rear yard and side yard setback. Okay? And the parking, 3.5 feet further back than the front of the house. Whether it's enclosed or not, doesn't matter. To make sure that an emergency responder get that doggone gurney to the front door. Can't tell you how many times, and I follow stuff that goes on in emergency response. And a lot of these newer subdivisions, first responders are not able to get to the front door without traipsing through wet grass and everything else. Try to deal with a call. So these numbers are thought out. Now back to that screen, Mike, if you don't mind. That's what you're looking at, right there. New development, that set of specs you just saw. Okay? That's what you're looking at now for new development. This is pretty much what your typical builder is perfectly okay with. This street right-of-way is wider than the street right-of-way you require today. So while I brought the setback closer, I expanded the street space, which goes all the way back to these pedestals. So you have essentially very little difference. It's actually 4 feet of difference between the edge of the street itself and the front of the house itself. So that's a little bit of an introduction to a standard. Now remember I said you have to have the standards in place now. It can't be subjective. So if you put something that works in general for most of the larger builders that are out there right now, then it makes everything pretty easy for them and for you, for the people that live in these homes, for the people that live in homes nearby. It works. If somebody wants to go tighter than this, it would require rezoning to an overlay district this is important, it would require rezoning to an overlay district that would allow for much tighter standards on design, on the houses and everything else. In other words, the new state law will not let you really put any standards on the houses themselves unless the developer agrees to it. There's no better way to get the developer to agree. If they want to come in and do 5 units an acre, that's 3. If they want to come in and do 5 units an acre, then you need to trade that density for quality, meaning they're paying attention to the yard. So I'm going to ask Mike to advance through a couple of slides here. We're going to jump over to something I want to show you. Keep going. Back up one, Mike, just for a second. That big house, that's townhouses. That's how you use design to bring townhouses into a single family area. A lot of people see it and they think it's some giant mansion or something. It's actually townhouses. Okay, keep going, but I use that to talk about something else. Keep going, a little bit more, a little bit further. Hold up right there. What you see at the top and the bottom is open spaces that are good versus bad. So it gets into the quality of the spaces that these developers set aside. In the lower photograph, you see a wall on that bank. There are now houses in that flat, and that wall.
Hang on a second, Rick.
Yeah.
Stacy, would it be okay if I turn this light out, because there's so much glare, I can barely see the screen. Are you okay?
Excellent. Thank you. I thought I was maybe moving too fast for you, sir.
No.
I've already overstayed my welcome. But I think this is important for you. And until the boss behind me comes up here and taps me on the shoulder, I'm going to keep working.
When the mayor winks at me, you'll get a tap.
Got it. So we got the cues now, okay?
I'm good if the
So-
board's good. I like this sort of stuff, so.
It's good stuff.
Or you'll have to tell me when to cut him off.
Down at the bottom, you'll see a slope with a wall and a fence, and you notice behind that little fence, which you can't see because everything's grown up behind it, it means that they put in open space on a drawing and said, yeah, we're gonna put open space over here. If you can't get to it, you can't maintain it. Now you got that, that's the backyard. Next slide, please. Next slide, next slide, next slide, next slide. There you go. So what they do is they grade. They grade. Now, what I want to point out, and the members of the board notice this little stake right here. It's got a little ribbon on it. Can y'all see that up there? Yep. I know they can down here. That's the corner of this house's yard. This is this house's backyard. And this is this house's side yard. There's the street right there. So what kind of neighborhood has no place for you to even do anything? I mean, you just fall off of that porch. You've had it.
Be great in the winter.
And from that stake on down the hill is the next person's yard down here. So these folks are all looking at their roof. Next slide, please. Next slide. I talked about the 5 wins. This is where we actually go through and test. This is your old ordinance versus the new. Next slide. I won't come back to a couple of these tests. Next slide. That's calculus, right? Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. What I want to point out is that under your old, now R12 I use as an example, which is not actually what you have, but it's what you have. That's what I said. It's not actually what you have, but it's what you have. And, right, because there are some discrepancies in your ordinance that mean that what you say is not what you have to do. So it's got a little misleading information. While I'm stopped on that point, I want to stress it this way. If I'm a developer and I come into town and I say, okay, I'm getting this 40 acres up in Spencer, I'm gonna do a subdivision, and Kyle, you say I can get 8,000 foot lots and open spaces X, Y, Z, and I sit there and I run my numbers and I say, I think that'll work. I'm gonna make an offer on this to this couple over here that owns this property, and I'm gonna go for it. That'll work for me. And then I turn my surveyor, my engineer loose to start coming up with the drawings to turn in to this guy. And the engineer's coming to me and going, it's not working. If I lose 10%, let's go back a slide or two. One more. Yeah, this is it. If I lose, go back one more. Here we go. If I lose a certain amount, okay, of my yield, my lots, build houses and sell houses, it makes the project not work. Now, you may not sympathize with them on that, but you're gonna wonder why they come in here and wanna beat you up after they couldn't get anything out of Kyle, because Kyle's doing his job. Your current ordinance with the 8, in theory, would yield 432 lots on a 100-acre tract of land. That's what your current ordinance says.
Say it again.
100-acre tract of land, your current ordinance on all that RH you got out there would yield 432 lots. That's 4.32, that's a density of 4.32. Next slide. In reality, your R8, excuse me, next slide. There we go. Your R8, in reality, because of some other things which appear in red that are hidden in your ordinance today, actually turns that into 2.24. I lost almost 50%. If I lose 15%, I'm now marginal. If I lose 50% of my expected yield, I'm gonna be up here screaming bloody murder. Do you know why you don't have anybody wanting to do any major development here? When they run their analysis, because they can find your ordinances online, they go, oh, no, it's not gonna work, never mind, click, click. You never know they visited you. Because they don't walk in the door quite as much as they used to. So you don't know what opportunities you've missed for people to build affordable housing or any kind of housing. You have no idea. So we have to shoot straight. Okay? So you saw that progression the whole time this SFR3 was sitting here. That was that picture on the front, that SFR3. That SFR3 yields 2.88. It says 3. We're telling people 3. The real yield is 2.88. That's right on the money. A real world building a neighborhood. And that's what this exercise does. It takes into account the side streets, the amount of land it takes for the right of way, everything, all the moving parts. Okay? So that's where we need to go with this. Now, when you get past 3 units an acre, you're going to run into problems. So let's back up a few, Mike. Back up a little bit further. A little bit more, a little bit more. There we go. Whoa, right here. See this line of sunlight here, how it makes kind of a V? When you're doing tract development, a lot of the tract or larger builders use a slab on grade technique now because of cost, and it's easier for them to do multiple houses at one time, whatever the reasons. It's a reality in the market. When they do this, they do it because the ground on the outside is about that far below the floor on the inside. And when that happens, the building code says that the ground has got to slope. If the ground outside is real close to what the level of your floor in the house, then the ground outside's got to slope so it doesn't allow water to work its way in. That's the building code, which can damage the structural integrity and the condition of the materials in the house. So they put in these big ditches. Notice this backyard. Where does this ditch go? It goes on around because they had to slope it. Land didn't naturally lay like that. So what does that do when you take a backyard and create a ditch for a backyard? Remember the big slopes on the other images and all that? Okay. When you get to about beyond 3 units an acre, these houses are close enough together to where you're running into that problem. You're telling everybody now that it's okay to do 4.3 units an acre. So you're stimulating, if you do get somebody to develop, you're setting them up to, you're not setting the developer up to fail, but you're setting the citizen that's going to live in that home up. So I'm a believer in us shooting straight with our policy. If we want higher density, there's only a couple ways you can do that. If you want to bring up higher density, like 4 units an acre, now let's back up another slide or two. You end up with slopes lateral slopes away from or towards the street, back up one more. You end up with houses that are built where you can see the sidewalk going down the hill, but you notice I use these houses with a lot of railing on them because you can tell what the porch is doing. It's close to the ground here and it's high above the ground there. So the ground is sloping naturally. The street is following that naturally. And by using a crawl space or a stem wall type construction, which is kind of slab on grade, but using little walls to make it work, to avoid those abrupt ditches, notice between these houses. These houses right here are closer together than the ones I showed you with the little V sticking out between. See where we're headed here? We have to deal with these little things and set things in motion for people to succeed. Now, let's go to the next slide forward. Keep going forward. We also are saying, keep going. One more. We've talked about the test. One more. I'll fail. One more. See how I had to put red like a control team, put red all over your worksheet? Next page. So, other places that people, I'm gonna sign up with you guys for a few minutes here, be part of your leadership team. Thanks for the promotion. I'm actually Kyle's assistant. That's my technical role. The difference between these neighborhoods is you've got floodplains, and this blue, it says 100-year floodplain out here, that's actually talking about this blue. The floodway is the middle of the blue, the floodplain is here, this is a 500-year, which is an unregulated floodplain. So if my property touches this blue, I have to buy flood insurance, that's federal law, if I have a mortgage. It doesn't matter where the house is. Now, my premium might be less if the house is on the hill, but the lot goes down into the floodplain. But if it touches it, I gotta buy it if I got a mortgage. It's an added cost that I pay every year, 30 years, because I have a mortgage. Then I can drop it if I want. A lot of ordinances stress lot size, and so what developers will do is they will push the lot lines on out into the creek, like this example on the left, where they push the lines all the way out the creek. Look at where the houses are. They're not going to be damaged by flood. It's a little small creek. All of this, everything you see on here, by the way, is within 3 counties. We're not talking about foreign things. We're talking about right here. Some of this is in Rowan County, some of this is in Cabarrus County, and a little bit of it is in Mecklenburg. So it's here. Looking at here. In these scenarios where they're narrow lots, but they run all the way back to the creek to get that minimum lot size and meet that, what is it Richard Pryor said? Residential district standard. So let's don't get hung up on the wrong thing. Let's don't get hung up on the wrong thing. Let's set our new homeowners that move here, that come here, our young families, who wants their kids to come back home and work and be nearby? Who wants their grandkids to live in the same town? You know, that was a normal thing many years ago. Nowadays, so many people will leave small towns for jobs and everything else. How do we attract them back here? We have to do it with the quality of the neighborhoods. And quality doesn't mean expense versus inexpensive. It means thinking through these numbers and making sure that the developers are setting it up to where it works for everybody. Okay? So that's a very quick introduction. We could go into the weeds on this stuff big time. Believe me. So with that said, I've kind of given you an overview of the ordinance. Now I'm going to ask Mike. Mike gets to be my assistant right now. Mike, can you key up the reading guide, please? Is there a reading guide in the front of these? There is.
Yes.
Perfect. For those of you that pick up the notebook, there's a reading guide in the front. For those of you that go to the digital versions, there'll be a separate file for the reading guide, but look at it. This is what it walks you through. And I don't want you to pay as much attention to the detail as the categories. The first category is administrative and procedural. Most of that is stuff that the state enabling legislation puts in play. We just lost it, Mike. The reading guide went away. Now, there we go. Lost it again. Now, ordinances like this are very difficult to write like a story. So you're not going to see once upon a time on page 1 and the end on the last page. We build it in silos. The first one, Article 1, creates this thing. The second article is the stuff that the average citizen needs to know that lives in a house in a neighborhood. If I want to put up a fence, if I want to do a swimming pool, if I want to do an outbuilding, if I want to do anything, add a room on, the normal driveways, all that kind of stuff is in that Article 2. That's why that first grouping skips Article 2. That first grouping, 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 14, 22, and 23, because the scarier stuff gets to the back. That's enforcement, things like that, nonconformities, the grandfather clause, that's 22 and 23. Those are largely driven by the general statute. So you've got a little bit of leeway in there. We can change a few things. You know, we can have it to where, you know, Kyle gets to be the mayor for a while and all, not really, but you know what I mean? We can change some procedures around a little bit, but not a lot, okay? But that's where all of that stuff is spelled out. A rezoning, a variance, an appeal to a decision that Kyle makes. Okay? The planning board, the board of adjustment, flexibility, permits and plats and procedures around submittals, what they have to turn in. And all of them are in nice little compartments. Okay? Nice little compartments. 14 is buried down there in 14 because I wanted it close to the real stuff. So if an engineer is struggling, they see that flexible development standards provision right there and they don't have to go digging with a shovel to find it. It jumps out at them like a big red flag. So that's what that is. The second, we'll call that the boring parts. That first grouping up there is the boring stuff, okay? The second grouping is basically your mandates, which are largely things that the state has inherited from the Fed level, environmental, things like that. That's where that flood stuff is. That's where your stormwater and watershed types of things fall into, sediment and erosion control types of things fall into. Those mandates get passed down from the Fed to the state, and the state doesn't want them. So they push them over your way as much as possible. Now, we're not getting into sediment and erosion control business. I want to stop on that one for a moment to point it out. We're not getting into that business, but we've got an abbreviated piece in there so that you have a foot in the game. So if a citizen, and I'm a reenactment actor on the side, I'm going to say it this way. If I call Kyle one day and I go, Kyle, there's red water flowing right in my garage from this thing going on next door that they're not doing a very good job with. Kyle has two choices. Number one, he can say, well, that's not our jurisdiction. You'll need to call the state on Monday because it's only going to happen on Friday afternoons, right around 5 o'clock. That's not a very good position to put your citizens in. The second is for him to have the authority to get that developer's attention or get that builder's attention or whatever's causing that red mud to flow into somebody next door yard or house or whatever, and get them to do something. Get them to get out there and get their attention. So it gives him the ability to get their attention. Okay? The state's still going to be the one that resolves it in the end, but at least your citizen knows that your own person was able to at least get the ball rolling. You follow me? That's why that does it. So it gives you kind of a standing, doesn't take over that permitting and that review of soil sediment and erosion control from the state. It leaves it with the state, but it makes it an inherent part of your ordinance, so you can at least include it in if you had to go as far as a stop work order or something like that to get a problem taken care of for an adjoining property owner or a homeowner. So that's what the mandates are. So the mandates aren't part of the boring part. They are their own grouping called the extra boring, double boring, as boring as it can possibly get, because there's not a whole lot we can do. Flood, for example, we can change the name, we can change our community ID number, and we can change the number of inspections that you get. Do you want 1, 2, or 3 certifications on that from the surveyor? That type of thing. That's it. So I wanted to point those top 2 out. So you're not going in here and saying, oh my gosh, reading about a variance is just killing me. You know, starting on page 1 and reading on through. So you can bounce around in there, okay? That third grouping, the big grouping there, which is about 40% of the ordinance, is actually the character elements. And that's what I've been talking about mostly tonight. The character elements are what makes Spencer, Spencer. It's what creates and defines your neighborhoods, the characteristics, the standards for design and development in the community. And it covers the whole spectrum, not just the older neighborhoods and the new neighborhoods, but also your business areas and everything else, okay? It covers that well. So you're going to see extensive treatment for things like the use table and all that Kyle mentioned earlier that list out a lot more things than you've got in your use table now, because under the state's court ruling, this is a court ruling that started it all. If you don't speak to it directly in your ordinance, you have to find the nearest similar category. So if your ordinance doesn't have something that deals with, we'll call it hazardous waste or hazardous industry that produces a hazardous waste, and somebody comes along and says, well, we're going to do a hog farm, you pick it, then it's going to get categorized into something like general heavy industry, okay? And you're not going to be able to say diddly squat, okay? So now you've got those tools in the toolbox. So it categorizes some things very broadly. If they produce any of these real problems, it has to go to a hazardous industry overlay or heavy industry overlay rezoning, which requires a rezoning. Then it's got in the special use standards all the criteria they have to meet. So you've got the tools to approve it, but it's not an automatic thing. You've got the tools to approve it. The first would be a rezoning from industrial to heavy industrial in an overlay, and then a special use permit, which requires them to submit their closure plan. For those of you that have been around in industrial, you'll know that if they do anything that handles products that your municipal wastewater system can't handle, like dyes. A lot of the mills would have dyes that would get into the wastewater stream. Well, they had to pre-treat that before they released it to the town system. Okay? To do that, that meant anything that dye touched had to be disposed of someday in a special way. So the EPA actually requires that industry to do a closure plan. What happens when this business stops operating? So we ask for that. We simply say that's a requirement. They have to give us a copy of that closure plan. A lot of towns would try to come up with what they have to do. We don't need to do that. The EPA's already done that. All we want is that to be part of our permit record. So we use a lot of common sense here. Remember, we want to be pro-citizen, pro-business, pro-natural resources, pro-leadership, and working with those that want to invest here. So we can grow our community the way that we try to grow it. So those character elements deal with the districts. They deal with all the nuances like parking and landscaping. I call the parking, landscaping, and signage the BLT, the bacon, lettuce, and tomato of the ordinance, because those 3 articles go together. So an engineer is going to have a big screen like this and open all 3 of those, because you can't do a parking lot without dealing with landscaping. And where does your sign go? Right. The box is the box. The building is the building. The rest of it's the part that the design people have to make work on the land, the driveways and everything else. The other peanut butter and jelly combination is the subdivisions, open space, and streets. Those three go together when you're designing a new subdivision, because you've got to deal with block issues and infrastructure issues and all those things that go with it, plus your open space requirements, et cetera, et cetera. So subdivision, streets, and open space go together like peanut butter and jelly, maybe with some banana on it. Okay? Now, I've tried to rush this through, and I'm gonna stop now. There's a million more things I could go into for you, but I wanted to give you an overview so you kind of knew the direction that this takes you, and it brings you into the modern time. Remember, the part of the purpose was to not only meet the requirement for you to update your ordinances for that new statute, but why not go ahead and modernize to contemporary standards so that it works under that new situation. And here's the scary part, because one of the things that the new statute did is it made challenges. Let's say someone disagrees with the town on an approval, and they take it to court, and they find that the town skipped a step. The courts do not care about that neighborhood. They do not care about that business. They do not care about whether you think it ought to be commercial, or you think it ought to have a buffer, or you think the houses ought to be this, or you like apartments or don't, or any of that. The courts frankly don't care about that. They care about one thing: due process. Did you violate somebody's rights when you were progressing through this process? And it's one of the most common things to happen is to skip a procedural step. Going forward, unlike in the past, it's going to be more expensive. In the past, most judges would tell both sides to go home and pay their own attorneys after they ruled. Now it's automatic. Town loses, town pays full freight. Now, if that other side had to get you in a courtroom, they've got experts, they've got lawyers. They're going to also throw carry costs like interest or losses, all kinds of things into that bucket to justify as their cost for this loss. So no longer are you facing like a $60,000 cost to see one through Superior Court. You're now looking at far more than that, not double, far more than that. So that's why when the statute says something like that, that's why we say we've got to now have much more specific standards, but at the same time, we've got to go ahead and set things in play to where we're not vulnerable. So, with that said, there's a lot of detail here. And so, if I may, Mr. Mayor, what I'm presenting to the mayor, to all you as the board, to the town management, is a certificate for 2 years at no cost to you of administrative support for your staff on the new ordinance. So while they're sort of learning new way to go about some things, we'll be there. Okay, now that doesn't mean we're going to be reviewing site plans for them. It means we're going to be answering questions. Well, should I be? Where do I find? How? What do you think? That kind of stuff for your team, for your staff, for Kyle and his whole department back there. Right? So we're going to be there for that. Technical assistance would be at a cost. So if he says, hey, I'm not real sure about this grading plan, can y'all take an hour or two and look at it and give me your feedback on it so we can get the comments back to the designer for that project? Not a problem. Then we would have to charge for that, assuming you've got a schedule to where they pay some kind of permit application fee anyway. Then you should have enough to handle that. But there's also one more piece in there, and it's in the top part, Mayor, under administrative support. If the state changes this chapter of law again in such a way that requires your ordinance to be updated in the next 2 years, we will do that at no cost. we're not gonna pay your advertising fees. You're still gonna have to cover your hearings and stuff, but we will do the work and get it back through staff and planning board to you and things like that to do it. And right now, there are actually 2 bills floating around in Raleigh that already have us looking at what we may have to do. I don't worry too much about them until they become law, because my job is whatever the law is whatever the law is. I have to work within it, just like you do. So I don't lobby or anything like that. But there's some crazy ideas in it, in some of the new ones. So with that said, Mayor, any questions from the board?
Well, thank you so much. This is wonderful information, and knowing we have your backing and support for the next 2 years as we start to implement this is comforting. So thank you very much for your work. I'll open it up to the board now for questions. I know Mr. Bish had one, I believe.
Well, first, it's a tremendous undertaking that I see before me with this preparation of this and the map. And for the committee that worked on it, planning and zoning, they did a bang up job, Kyle, and everyone involved. I just got it 2 days ago. So I'm gonna need time to eyeball it, to digest what I've seen, to mull it over and so forth. But there was something that stuck out that I wanted to know if there are going to be opportunities to provide some input into something that might have like questions. Like, for instance, in the RMST district, where the listed uses could be for a single family 7 units per acre, or an attached unit 16 units per acre. And the fact that most of the historic district and most of the town around this area is in the RMST district. Now, when you look at 16 units per acre, that's tight. Even 7 is tight in an area where there's very little open space.
Right.
You know, unless you start knocking down some buildings and so forth. But so I just wanted to know between, you know, working out density and the choices that were made for the fact that most of the industrial sector of the town would be up by Sam's area, and most of the car places are going to be down by the Salisbury border and so forth. And I know that you put the ag area for future development, mostly, you know, kind of like a hold on to that area. So I'm just wondering, you know, what kind of opportunities will we have to more or less to.
So,
Let me address that if I may, Mayor.
Sure.
And Alderman Bish.
Mhm.
First of all, to sort of address the subject of that example, we know that there's limited opportunities for anything to come in and just do any kind of large scale redevelopment. But the tool is in the toolbox, because suppose somewhere in that RMST there was a property that could handle, say 4 or 5 attached townhouse or a little infill apartment. Where I grew up at the corner, there was a little building with 8 apartments in it, and there were teachers and things like that were in there that fit into the neighborhood. Now, later on, it ended up with a lot more seniors. My grandmother had a very good friend who was a widow that lived there, and it worked out perfectly for her because of the maintenance issues, things like that. So it allows for a little bit of flexibility. But step one is somebody's got to assemble enough that they can actually do something. And so the numbers are not there to go in and start knocking down much. So the reality is you're probably going to have very little of that kind of density in there. But if you had a 2-story, 4-unit little apartment on a corner outside the historic district that was in that RMST, that provided an option for me to not mow my grass anymore as I get on up, but I can stay in my neighborhood. It's called aging in place. And so it gives you that opportunity. Now, if you really, you know, you're not looking at a big development like somebody getting 10 acres in an RMST and doing anything of any real size. So that 7 per acre is how you would translate, say I've got a half an acre. It means, what could I do? I'm looking at about 3 units per acre, because you got to round down. You see what I mean? So I could get 3 units if I had a half an acre. That's what it realistically means.
So, Bob, and let me hit one thing on that too,
Okay.
is keep in mind, this zoning map, the intent is to capture what is physically on the ground now.
No.
Correct.
The future will be shaped by, and this is the next piece, is our comprehensive land use plan that will be starting, I believe, next year. So that captures what the future looks like, that then would have to go through a rezoning if any of this changes.
Right,
The other piece of that is, based on what's existing on the ground now, is we do have apartment complexes
Right.
within the RMST, and we've got those 50-foot lots within the RMST that, you know, that's part of, there's a 42-foot set or minimum lot width now in that.
well, the only thing that triggers that for me though is that basically the zoning would make it a as of right type of
Yeah.
thing for developers, that as of right, if they bought up enough houses or leveled enough houses, they could put 16 units per acre on a particular plot or something like that.
Provided they met all the standards that would apply, and there's a ton of standards for that. So it's not intended to swing a door wide open. It's intended to shore up what's there, but have enough opportunity to where it realistically will work. If the numbers work to go in and buy up 10 houses and tear them down, which I couldn't imagine, something like that, in order to try to assemble 5 acres or something along those lines, or 4 acres, that's not necessarily a feasible acquisition for a developer. Because if they have to pay a lot more for a house than they would for raw land, you follow me? The true multifamily is really in your mixed use 1 district or your mixed use 2 district.
Right,
And that's
right.
that's where you've really got room for maybe a little bit more new, and there's not a lot of it out there, that we're not putting a lot of it out there except what's already kind of like that. Okay. I want to also mention to you, Alderman Bish, that you were asking a little bit about the opportunities. Unfortunately, we're up against the wall with the state's deadline. Okay, that's not our doing at all. We've been working as hard and fast as we can go. That's why, as the chairman pointed out, they were meeting more than 1 time a month, several months, 2 and 3 and 4 times. Okay, the next process is, if you have your hearing in early June, that doesn't mean, so I wouldn't put off the hearing. Go ahead and get your hearing. So you've got that information. You've got people's feedback and everything else, but you've got until the end of June to make it effective, and any changes that we can make. You are not bound by, forgive me, Mr. Chairman, you're not bound by the planning board's recommendation. They are bound to give you one, but you're not bound to stick exactly to it. Some boards might tweak a little something here or a little there. Now, I'm not encouraging you to change it, because I think it's a solid policy. But you do have the right to adjust that policy, okay? Without going back for further hearing. Because the whole idea is that you get their recommendation, and then you take in the public's feedback. That's more the me in my backyard, the people that live next door, this lot or that lot perspective. And you get to, as the Board of Aldermen, balance that out and make the final call. And so we'll be kind of on the edge of our seat, hustling along with you as changes come together. So if there are any. And what we do is we track those so that when you do reach a point at a meeting, likely in June, where you're ready to vote on the new ordinance, then the motion would be something to the effect of because what we're advertising is what they sent up, what the planning board sent up. So it would be to adopt with the following modifications. And we document that so it goes in Clerk World for the record, and it's there for any tracking and any justification when somebody says, well, hey, how did this happen, or how did that happen? So we show how you got from the version that popped up from the planning board to the version that you ultimately adopt. There's a clear paper trail. So there's not a problem with changes. It's just, I want you to think through them. When I answer your questions, I'm gonna try to give you enough information to make a very informed decision. Okay? Thank you. Thank you for your question, Mr. Bish. That
Sure,
was
Bob,
very
I
good.
think too, now that we've got this, we have an opportunity between now and the public hearing to review internally as a board. And then, based on what we hear then in the public hearing and any comments through our review, then we can reconcile those with our team to come up with that final version.
And I will say, I think our goal in terms of town staff is to work with y'all. We could hold special sessions during the next couple of months to talk through any specific questions that y'all have in small group settings. We're going to be happy to accommodate that for you.
After I file my taxes.
The other reality, I think, too, is and I think Mr. Mosher's expressed this to me, that, we recognize as we implement this, over the course of time, there are going to have to be revisions to it as we get into it. And some things are tried, and so I think that was one of the things that, Mr. Floyd, you had reiterated the planning board, that, it's not like once we approve this, it's set in stone. There's the ability as we move forward over the coming months to make changes to it as needed. But the key is now, this is the gospel when it comes to development and land use within our town. And so we want to be sure that that we're eliminating that subjectivity and everything is documented here in this ordinance.
Mr. Mayor, just to give you a little bit of a picture of the process that unfolded in the legislature, this started back in 2014 with a committee of the State Bar Association, and there were 3 that were appointed to start working on it. It sort of stayed off the docket for a long time, and a lot of us had an opportunity to contribute. I was one of many, and we did. And then it suddenly appeared out of nowhere in 2019 and was adopted as Session Law 2019-111 in June of 2019. And they set a deadline of January 1, 2021, which was this past January, and they also set an effective date the same day. So I was writing ordinances that had to stay under the old law and the new law because nobody was going to meet on New Year's Eve and time it just right. And then COVID came along. And so in April, I believe it was, a bill, the COVID relief bill at the state level came through the House and Senate. And it included one little tiny provision that kicked the can down the road and said that the due date would move from January 1 over to August 1 of this summer. And then 2 months later, a more complicated bill came out that made a lot of fine-tuning adjustments, but it also moved that date from August 1 backwards to July 1. So they extended it 7 months, okay? Then they took a month back. And so a lot of towns talked like maybe they were going to extend it again, but here we are in early May, and the deadline is July 1, which means you need to vote on it in June. So you've got that timeline crunch, and we apologize for that, but there's nothing we can do about that. And I just wanted to iterate that because if your old stuff, it's sort of a Cinderella story, like the pumpkin. It at midnight, June 30th, your old ordinances will all turn back into a pumpkin. Okay? And that's why the urgency there to maintain that deadline. And that's not something please do not think I'm trying to push y'all at all. I push the planning board pretty good.
It was fun. Yes, it was fun.
Right. And we would,
When you look forward, this guy's an expert. Very good teacher.
You humble me.
No comment from the gallery.
He sat through the meetings too.
All right, any other questions from the board at this time? All right, well, thank you very, very much. We appreciate it. We do have one action as a board to take this evening, and that would be to have a motion to go ahead and set the public hearing for June 1st to receive public comments on the draft SDO, draft official zoning map, and the draft technical standards and specifications manual. It's a motion by Ms. Hovis.
I'll second it.
There's a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor? All right. All those opposed? That is approved unanimously. The public hearing will be on June 1st. My understanding, Kyle, is that we're planning to hold that here at Town Hall, correct?
Yes, the meeting will take place here at 6 o'clock on June 1st. And the notice that we provided for y'all does indicate that date. All right, well, thank y'all very much.
Thank you.
And like I said,
Mr.
these
Flood,
have
thank
been
you.
printed specifically for y'all. So if you don't already have a copy, please take a hard copy binder and a zoning map.
Thanks to all of you for all of that work.
Yeah.
Mr. Moser, Mr. Gobble, thank you for coming tonight.
Thank
We
you.
enjoyed it, thank y'all.
Very much.
Thank you.
They did great, I can assure you.
All right, motion. So those are our copies.
I saw it.
Yeah.
Alderwoman Sledge, thank you, because I know you've sat in on all of that, and you've worked right alongside them, so thank you.
Could give us some hits along the way there.
Right there it is.
It's
Yeah, there was a link,
You
the books are there, there was a link previously sent out. to the electronic
gonna be
version.
huge.
House.
Yes, so as the drafts were being produced, those were provided and updated accordingly. We would keep you up to date as that changed, and yes, so it's been a few weeks of this. Yes, everybody who does not currently have one of these is welcome to take one, as well as a big map.
Little light reading. Mhm.
Okay. With that,
Wow.
we'll start into our agenda review. So we'll start with, actually, let's start, do I have a volunteer to lead the invocation on Tuesday night?
I will.
All right, Ms. Seacrest. All right, and then recognitions, we will be recognizing Tammy Hatley for her service as interim town clerk. And we'll plan to make that recognition. Do we have other recognitions as well? Mr. Miller?
I'd like to recognize Samuel Lipsky and his wife for what they did up here on the panel boxes.
So say that again to Mr. Lisenby.
Yes, Samuel and Ashley Lipsky.
So Samuel, and then Ashley is his mom,
Ashley is his mom.
right?
She'll have to drive him up here as far as they get, but I'd like to recognize him for what
Okay,
his work
will
on.
you, can you, well,
I will take care of the in-law.
okay. Mr. Miller, then I will let you be the one to make that recognition.
Gonna give his badge, definitely.
Gotta get a-
Okay, other recognitions.
I'd like to recognize the librarian Beverly McCall
Okay.
for organizing the May 1st celebration. Unfortunately, I didn't get to go, but I heard all about it, read about it. And that's definitely above and beyond her assigned duties, so I appreciate her doing that. And let's recognize the graduating seniors, too. If they'll graduate at the end of May. That's a group.
Correct. You want to do both of those?
I'll be glad to.
Perfect. Any others? I do think it would be, probably we'll hold this for the June meeting, probably more appropriate, that would be to recognize all of our planning board members for the work that they put in
Yeah.
over the past several months. So we'll hold that for June if that's okay, since that'll be, we'll call this public hearing and. Okay. Any others?
Well, that Public Works Department did a great job on that mulch field. And I heard a lot of people talking about how nice that was. I think that's great service that our town provides.
Okay, so why don't you do this? You can just recognize both the library and Public Works for their
Yes, ma'am.
role in the May 1st events.
Okay?
Okay? Okay. All right, next item will be approval of the minutes. So you have 3 sets of minutes, one from the April pre-agenda meeting, one from the regular meeting, and one from the called meeting that we had on April 28th. Any comments, questions, or corrections on those? If not, do we want to move those to the consent agenda?
Yes.
Everybody good?
Yeah.
The Sledge? Are you good?
In the last, if you consider authorizing the arts contract, for fiscal year end, at the very last of it, I had a question about whether that was right.
Which one?
We,
Which set of notes?
I'm sorry, I'm sorry, it's the minutes from the regular meeting,
April 13th.
April 13th, on page 3, page 4.
We can, I can work with Stacy and, we can get that clarified tomorrow and provide an updated, set of minutes to the board.
I think we decided to go ahead and, instead of having the audit wrapped up this year, we're going to take a look at it.
And I think this was attempting to, summarize the discussion, but we will make an adjustment here and, we'll get an updated draft out tomorrow.
Just revise the language, okay. So with that, is there a motion to put that on the consent agenda with the change to that item?
So moved.
Or we don't really have, sorry, we don't even need a motion for that. We have general consensus. Next item. We'll have a presentation of the website demo for Miller Davis on
Yes.
Tuesday night.
That's correct.
Okay, great. Looking forward to it. All right, we will also receive an FY '22 funding request presentation from the Transportation Museum. Betsy Mallory will come. If you recall, each year for the past couple years, they've requested annual funding. They've requested $2,500 this year. I do want to give a little bit of background before we hear from Betsy next week. Last year, I think we asked that they prepare a written request to us prior to budgeting so we could actually plan to budget it in. And so they did that, and they reached out to us this year again, and I asked that they made sure that they did that so we could consider that in our budget. They're asking for $2,500. I do want to give a little background on that. They are asking for it this year rather than for events, since the events are kind of up in the air. They want to use that for marketing related purposes. What I would suggest is that we also make sure that if we choose to do that, that we are requesting that the town of Spencer be included on that marketing material, our new logo, that sort of thing, so that we are publicized with any marketing material they put out using that money. And then the other thing I wanted to point out was I did have a chat with Kelly Alexander, and one of the things she mentioned was part of their request each year is kind of a goodwill thing in that they have to seek approval from the state for funding and from other grant organizations and things like that. And one of the things with the state, they have to turn in a report every year that helps justify their funding. One of the pieces they put in that is where they have received support from other community organizations. And so it means a lot on that report they submit to the state that they're able to show that Rowan County each year and the town of Spencer each year provide some level of support to them. So I just wanted to mention that, to the board. Yes, Peter.
And just by way of procedure, my recommendation would be that the board hear the presentation and whatever feedback you may have, if you'll provide that to me, I'm happy to then incorporate that into the budget recommendation. And then you could consider that as part of the overall budget.
Thank you, Ms. Lynch.
Do I remember correctly that last year they were asking us for 5,000?
Yeah.
That's correct, but we only gave 2,500.
Right. So this year they dropped the request to
They have.
25. Okay.
Yep.
Fair enough.
All right, departmental reports, anything on that, Peter?
Nothing out of the ordinary for tonight.
Anything on the town manager report tonight?
No, sir.
Okay. All right, next item for consideration will be, the resolution to declare a 2007 Ford Crown Vic as surplus property. And that is attachment 5. My understanding is a recommendation from our mechanic, Chad Eagle, based on the ongoing maintenance issues with that car, that it be declared surplus plus property.
Eric, I got a question about the city when you guys surplus property. Is that money going back to the police fund or is it going to the general fund?
So the revenues, of course, the police is part of the general fund. Any revenues that we receive, whether it be from this or anything, are tracked in revenue accounts. And if we, something like this may have already been, in terms of vehicle sales revenues, it depends on the budget, whether or not they were already appropriated as a balanced expenditure somewhere else. So in other words, if we expect to sell a vehicle in the coming fiscal year, we'll budget the revenue for that as part of the budget. This would,
I guess you're missing my question.
Okay.
Is the, when the funds off the vehicle when it's sold, is it going to general or is it going back to police?
You mean fund balance
Yeah,
or,
fund
okay.
So which one's it going?
it would depend, so to better explain it, the revenue itself wouldn't go to any departmental expenditure account. It would either, they go into, all of our revenue accounts are a separate listing of accounts that we use to create a balanced budget through expenditures. And so it depends whether or not the revenue is, if the revenue is above what we planned for the year on something, that's what contributes to fund balance at the end of the year. But if it's expected to meet projected revenue, then, that's what we're using to drive our budget throughout the year. I don't know if, hopefully that explains, but.
No, it's clear to me, but.
Okay.
Now, the last question is, because I don't even want to be there for secret, how about the car itself? When you guys put it out for surplus, you are putting it out advertising for, like, how are you putting it out for yourself?
We are using Gov Deals as an online auction. We recently auctioned 2 vehicles after the board previously surplused them. And in both cases, they received, I think they were sold off for between $1,000 and $1,500 a piece. One of the vehicles was a very used vehicle that the town purchased used for a few $100s, and it was auctioned off at the end for about $1,000. So, but that's how we accomplish the sale is through the Gov Deals website, which many local governments use for surplus items.
So is that a consent agenda item?
Yes.
All right, consider authorizing town manager and staff to accept and implement a Blanche and Julian Robertson Family Foundation grant for Standback Forest construction. And that, I believe, is a $10,000 grant, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
That we received, or that we've received, from the Robertson Foundation. And that would be for, I believe, the additional, property that's being, gifted to the town, for an additional 48 acres. And I believe, we applied for a grant that could help support, view trails and maintenance of trails in that area.
We
Um,
make that a discussion item and have available the actual wording of this authorization.
Yes. And then that's attachment 6. Yep, and you'll see in there in attachment 6, you've actually got the grant provisions and conditions and that sort of thing, and so we can keep that. And we have Joe Morris give an update on that one.
Yes.
Okay. All right, next item is to consider receiving a report of the Stand Back Forest Trails from staff, and so that'll tie right in. Again, that'll be a discussion item. And then the next item is a resolution authorizing the police chief to enter into the 2021 Regional Law Enforcement Agency Mutual Aid Agreement, Resolution 21-006. I would recommend holding this one for discussion. Do we not need to?
We can do whatever you,
Do we?
regular rollover, repeated thing.
This was a 5-year agreement from 2016 that's expiring, and the COG sent this to ask us to renew it.
Is there a need for the board for discussion, or do you want to add it to the consent agenda?
If you don't have a problem with it, go on.
No, we have to have it, so.
It's pretty well common sense, so let's go ahead and put it in common sense.
Just wanted to make sure there weren't any questions by the board on language or anything like that on it. Okay. Next item, consider authorizing the audit contract for fiscal year ending June 2021. And so we will hear a recommendation. I believe, Peter, you got proposals from 2 different groups. Is that correct?
We actually received, we received 3, and we sent out to 8 firms and received 3 proposals back. In addition, a letter saying they weren't able to submit a proposal from a 4th. And of those proposed, this is the one we recommend.
Okay. So with that, we'll have that as a discussion item.
Yes.
And the next one too, I would recommend the discussion item. We get Joel to give us an update, and that would be authorizing the town manager to negotiate and execute contract with AMT for a pavement condition survey. And if you recall, that was one of the things we said for our capital planning that we needed, was to actually get an inventory of our streets and the condition so that we could better prioritize how we're spending our Powell bill money. All right. With that, that is all that we have on the agenda for next Tuesday evening. And so there is a need tonight briefly to go into closed session per section 143-318.11, item 5, which is for the consideration of purchase of real property, and the other is item 6 for personnel. Is there a motion to go into closed session? Motion by Ms. Hovis, is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mayor Pro Tem, all in favor? All right, all opposed? All right, that is unanimous, and we are in closed session.